There we go. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again in person and through our YouTube videos. We are back to look at some more wisdom literature, in particular Proverbs, and we're returning with chapter 18. Can I get a volunteer to read this chapter for us? And
I'll start.
keep in mind what verses jump out at you as interesting, unusual, or seem still particularly wise, or maybe not so wise anymore. Go ahead.
The one who lives alone is self-indulgent, showing contempt for all who have sound judgment. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing personal opinion. When wickedness comes, contempt comes also, and with dishonor comes disgrace. The words of the mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a gushing stream. It is not right to be partial to the guilty, or to subvert the innocent in judgment. A fool's lips bring strife, and a fool's mouth invites a flogging. The mouths of fools are their ruin, and their lips a snare to themselves. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body. One who is slack in work is close kin to a vandal. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. The wealth of the rich is their strong city. In their imagination it is like a high wall. Wow. Before destruction one's heart is haughty, but humility goes before honor. If one gives answer before hearing, it is folly and shame. The human spirit will endure sickness, but a broken spirit who can bear? An intelligent mind acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. A gift opens doors, it gives access to the great. The one who first states a case seems right, until the other comes and cross-examines. Casting the lot puts an end to disputes and decides between powerful contenders. An ally offended is stronger than a city. Such quarreling is like the bars of a castle. From the fruit of the mouth one's stomach is satisfied. The yield of the lips brings satisfaction. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. The poor uses entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. Some friends play at friendship, but a true friend sticks closer than one's nearest kin.
Wow. What jumps out?
Well, a lot of these are absolutely true, but some of them are, wow.
Yeah, I saw you, I heard you react to number 11. The wealth of the rich is their strong city in their imagination. It is like a high wall.
So, what I was thinking is, that's the ultimate sarcasm right there.
Yeah, sort of. I think the emphasis in the first verse is it's their strong city, and I don't think it's coincidental that it falls after verse 10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower; the righteous run into it and are safe. Whereas
the wealth of the rich is their strong city.
Right, and in their imagination, it's like a high wall.
Mine leaves out the phrase "in their imagination."
It just says it is like a high wall.
Yeah. protecting him. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall protecting him.
Is it a coincidence that the next line is before destruction, one's heart is haughty?
It's hard to know for sure because these are a collection, but it does. I mean, a lot of these fit within a motif that actually includes some of the end of 17, especially 17:28. Even fools who keep silent are considered wise. When they close their lips, they are deemed intelligent. There's a lot of this about how one lives as a fool, right? Like you can be essentially, a sophomore, a wise fool, right? If you're a fool, keep quiet, listen, try to understand, seek wisdom, put your trust in the Lord, not in wealth. So there's a pretty hefty theme that runs through this section of Proverbs. I'm looking at a couple of different other translations of this to see about the imagination part. So I don't think it occurs. I don't think the word imagination occurs in the Greek or the Hebrew.
Which verse is that?
11.
Oh,
And so your translation is probably more accurate. I shouldn't say accurate, more precise.
What does yours say?
It doesn't say anything about a man. A rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall protecting him.
Okay. We still
Mine
talking about the
says
high wall.
Yeah.
The rich think of their wealth as a strong defense. They imagine it to be a high wall of safety.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that one.
So I have a bunch of other translations here. The property of a rich man is a strong city, and its honor gives much shade. And the Peshitta says, his strong city is glory and wealth, and a strong wall is his dwelling, which would seem to hang on. So in this case, it's not. So in the Peshitta, it's not about wealth. It's about being righteous. So in the Syriac translation, it becomes a continuation of 10 as a positive. That the wealth, in this case, is the righteousness bestowed upon, the righteousness of those who turn to God.
Oh, well, that's an entirely different interpretation.
Right, there's no sarcasm there at all.
They're not talking about worldly riches at all. Right?
In the Syriac.
So this brings up an interesting question. All the different versions of the Bible,
Yep.
is it because the leaders of the church, like if the ELCA sat down and decided they were going to write their own revised version,
Sure.
who would write it?
Well, it depends. So a lot of the early translations we have from like 1000 through, I don't know, 1600 or so, are translations done by either one individual with a group of students or scholars working under them. So it's that one person's instruction.
So be specific. Where did the Revised Standard Version, how did that
Yes.
come to be?
So the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version are a little different. They were there was a committee formed of biblical scholars who were taken from a group of different denominations, so that there was representation of diverse interpretations.
Who decided to do that?
I'd have to look into the history. I don't know how it got started.
Because here you've got, I mean, that in the whatever
Right,
the interpretation you read is entirely different than this is. Because this is talking about, I mean, today, 99.99 people who read this, only biblical scholars like you would interpret it in any other way, would read this as worldly wealth, for the rich is their strong city.
Right.
Whereas that's, according to that translation, they're talking about spiritual.
Well, there's
strength,
multiple translations. So this book is this is the Hebrew Bible Critical Edition, Proverbs, by Michael V. Fox, who was the dean of the Hebrew and Semitic Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin before he retired years ago. Anyway, when it comes to linguistics, biblical linguistics, he's near the top of the field, or at least was in his day. And so this is looking at, there's no interpretation in this book. This is all, here are the different translations, where they come from. It's purely academic. So the big advantage of having this is it gives us a way of looking at other translations that we often wouldn't see and having them translated in English for us. So it's the Peshitta translation does this, which is in the Syriac language. So there's always going to be some translation differences. But I think one of the things to note is that the majority of this, even the Syriac translation of this one verse, is more or less the same, but the translation of one word pretty significantly changed the meaning of the whole, right? So that's a big thing that's worth noting. The part of the problem is that we can't always do direct translations. Languages don't work one for one on a worldly scale. One of my favorite examples of this is in Hebrew, we have to translate certain words. And so for the people who wrote in biblical Hebrew, you felt things with your brain and you made logical, informed decisions with your heart, which is exactly the opposite of what we do. Actually, that's not true. You feel things with your kidneys and you make logical interpretations with your heart. So when we read in the Bible a translation of heart or mind, it's not always clear to us reading it in English what they're talking about. Because a lot of times we have a very feely interpretation of religion in our culture because the Bible references the heart so often. But the Bible references the heart often as the seat of decision making. It's where you rationalize and interpret and understand what's going on and come to a decision.
And that was the dominant understanding at the time of Christ?
Yeah. Well, we believe so. So it's the Greeks who bring in for the Israelite community, the Greeks bring in a different understanding of where thinking and thought processes go on in the body. I've often wondered, when you think things to yourself without vocalizing them. I don't know about you, but I hear them in my head, right? I assume most people do. I have often wondered, did the ancient Israelites hear thoughts inside their chest?
Well,
because of cultural interpretation.
From my point of view, I mean, that goes back to, I'm sitting here wondering, when was the first time a human being took a body apart and realized that there was a bunch of electrical wires leading down from the head?
Yeah, probably pretty late.
Well, autopsies became fairly common in, 1200s?
I mean,
but anyway,
people were taking apart bodies 4,000 years ago
Were
after
they?
death. Oh, sure. I mean, the Egyptians
they
were
were, but-
ripping out organs.
But if you took
For
apart,
mummification.
if you took apart a whole body, and, well, I guess the heart has tubes that go everywhere, so I guess that could be the source of.
Right. So, a couple other interesting things that affect translation. So, for one, the notion of forever or eternity or perfection does not exist in Hebrew. It's not there. There is no language for it. There's no, maybe in modern Hebrew there probably is. I mean, they've come up with words for all kinds of things in modern Hebrew. But in biblical Hebrew, the idea of eternity just doesn't exist. Forever is not a concept. There's no word for perfect. It's only through interaction with Greek philosophy that these words start to come into the Hebrew culture from which we get our scripture. It's kind of an interesting implication on a lot of what we believe today as Christians. The other side of it is the word for heaven literally means the sky, both in Greek and in Hebrew. Now, the notion that there is some higher, more idealistic world than this one comes from Plato, a Greek philosopher, not from Scripture. For the Israelites, for the people, at least up until Jesus, and there's room to argue that even for at least 100 years after Jesus, the only place you went when you died was Sheol. Everyone went to the same place. What Jesus and the Pharisees brought to the table through their understanding of the Hebrew Bible was this notion of bodily resurrection at some future date, right? And so there are scholars who actually argue, and we've had this conversation in here before, there are scholars who argue that our modern notion of going to heaven, which is a spiritual place after you die, just isn't in the Bible at all. And we've come to interpret that because we see the word sky, and we read heaven, and we associate it with life after death.
When was the Apostles' Creed originally written?
Oh, that's complicated. So, most likely it was not written by the apostles. There are those who still argue that. I'd have to look up the earliest reference, but I think the earliest reference is probably around 130 or so. So about 100 years after Jesus dies.
Every time I say the Apostles' Creed, I sit and I wonder whether the people who developed the Apostles' Creed were trying to convince themselves.
Yeah, so sort of. So one of the things we look at is we don't know exactly when the Apostles' Creed is developed because it isn't documented. But we know when the other creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed, are adopted, and we know the circumstances under which they're created.
But they're developed on the foundation of the original creed.
No.
No?
No, the Nicene and Athanasian creeds are polemical creeds. They are, the reason that we have them is to tell other Christians that they're wrong. That's the only reason those creeds are ever created, because there's a big debate going on in the church over some theological matter, and
But they came much later than the Apostles' Creed was developed.
Right.
So they had to have some basis in the Apostles' Creed.
I mean, they follow the same structure.
Yeah.
But their purpose isn't, their original purpose is not about concretizing the faith and teachings of Jesus and the apostles. They are dialectic and polemic. They're about making an argument and holding the whole church to that same argument. And I can't say that necessarily about the Apostles' Creed, but that's definitely the case for the Nicene and the Athanasian Creed. There are a bunch of people out there who did not believe the things that are in those creeds. And the councils voted to make that the official statement of the church so that they could use that.
So did those people leave the church then? They didn't believe it?
Yeah, and some of them are still around. So we did a class on heresies. And one of the things we talked about is how a lot of these heresies are still around, and a couple of things have happened that ever since the Reformation, really, but also some of it started when the church split between the East and the West, is that what had happened up until those two big splits in the church was that Christians who didn't uphold the teaching of the church would have to go off and start like their own cult-like beliefs, which would then either die off or would peter on a little, just trickling through time without much support or strength, right? Some of them surviving to present day, others not. But by the time once we get the Reformation, it now becomes normative to have many different interpretations of Christianity. And so all of a sudden, and then this becomes even more so another 500 years later when we have the Pilgrim move to the New World and the American Christianity, which is now you get to believe whatever you want and call yourself Christian or whatever. We've now reached a new level of Christianity where you can be a heretic according to the teaching of the church and still have an active large denomination that's functional and generally accepted by society. So we've kind of turned everything upside down in 200 years or 2,000 years. But yeah. No, and of course then that becomes the big debate is, did the church do the right thing by suppressing different ideas, beliefs, and theologies the first 1,000 years of the church? Or would it have been better to have promoted dialogue and not one single right way of thinking and teaching?
Applies to governments too.
Right.
Democracy or dictators are better.
It applies to anyone who says they have the answer. But that's an interesting thing about our scientific world is that for the most part, I know there's exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, that's been the standard of the scientific world, is to say, we are not going to hold that there's one absolute truth. We're going to let everybody have a say, everybody can redo the studies, everybody can publish their papers, and everybody will review everybody else's papers, in theory. Right? So the scientific community is actually arguably the first community in the world that has focused more on the debate than the answer.
And that's good.
Right.
And it's right here.
It's in Proverbs. It is in Proverbs.
It says, quote unquote, where is it here?
Something about listening before speaking.
No, it's... Oh, where was that?
15. An intelligent mind acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge.
No, that's not it. That's an obvious fact.
Yeah, okay.
Well, where is it? Oh, it talks about debate. Oh, yeah, 17. The one who first states a case seems right until the other comes and cross-examines. I love that. That is the best verse in Proverbs.
So far. No, but it's a good one.
And that's science. That is science.
It is. It is also our Hebrew Bible. And in a large part, it is what was happening in Judaism around the time of the Roman occupation as well. And a perfect example of that is the fact that our Hebrew Bibles, both for Jews and for Christians, includes Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ruth. Because Ezra, Nehemiah says, if you're married to a foreigner, you need to divorce her, abandon her, leave her, let them take the kids, they're corrupted too. We need to be pure Israelites. And Ruth says, if it weren't for foreigners, you'd all be screwed because all your kings are tainted with the blood of a foreigner, if you call that tainted, right? So we have both of those stories are in our Bible. They are very much opposed to each other theologically and philosophically. And yet, we preserve them. If we look at the rabbinic tradition... Go ahead.
Are they preserved because the people put together the Bible wanted opposing views?
It's hard to know what their motivation was. But what we can suggest that's likely had some influence on it, because if we look at the rabbinic tradition that develops over time after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, the second fall, the rabbinic tradition intentionally preserves the debate. So if you read the Talmud or the Mishnah, you get a lot of passages that say, so these two rabbis were talking, and one of them was saying this thing, and the other one was saying, no, it's this thing, and here was the debate and how it goes, right? And so they tell you the initial positions, they tell you what the debate was and why they argued it, and then oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the story ends with, and God intervened and did this thing to prove who was right. Or, they went to this other rabbi who is more respected, who said this is the right answer and this is what. So there's still a conclusion of they get to a right answer. But what's intriguing in it is that in the rabbinic tradition of the post-temple period, there's a deliberate effort to preserve the debate, both arguments, right? Even if they come to an answer, they preserve the argument, right? Which we don't get in Christianity much.
Yeah.
So, and if we look at the structure of the temple and the Sanhedrin, which is the religious governing authority during the period of the Roman occupation, we have a similar structure going on where we have a number of different, essentially denominations of Judaism who share seats, who all have seats on the Sanhedrin, almost like a senate. And there seem to be three main political parties: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes, and they definitely held different beliefs. So the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. The Pharisees believed in resurrection, and we're not really sure what the scribes believed because they were the third.
Scribes.
They were, well, no. Scribes doesn't necessarily mean it was a job. It was their group. They held theological beliefs and opinions, but we don't know a whole lot about them because they always played third fiddle to the Pharisees and Sadducees. So oftentimes they're just lumped in with one of the others. But we also know that there were at least a dozen other sects or denominations that were active in the time period that Jesus was active. And before and after. I mean, we know about the Qumran Society. There's another group called the Essenes, who some people think the people at Qumran and the Essenes were the same people. I would argue they're not, but they're similar. They're two groups who had at least similar, if not overlapping, in their positions. So we get a lot of this deliberate diversity in belief and interpretation throughout history until we get to Constantine. It's only after the emperor of the majority of the world says, "Oh, look, Christianity is spreading and it's compelling and convincing, and a lot of people are turning to it. I'll be a Christian." Or if you believe the story, he saw some sign in the clouds and that convinced him and he suddenly believed. Whatever the case is. Anyways, it's only when the emperor of a huge chunk of the world in which Christianity exists becomes Christian that we suddenly have a shift from there are a lot of different views to we really need to nail this down to the one right way. And then we eventually develop the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, and then we get the split between the East and the West, and then you got two right ways, depending on whether you're in the East or the West. And then the Reformation, and we get back to many right ways, or everybody thinking they have the right way. And then we have the modern world, which is chaos in religion. So, yeah. Okay, so history lesson over. We've still got 18 minutes. We can squeeze in, and we started a little late, so we can go a little over. We can still squeeze in 19, unless there's other verses that jumped out at anyone. Would someone volunteer to read 19?
I can.
Okay.
Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a man who is perverse in speech and is a fool. It is not good for a man to be without knowledge, and he who makes haste with his feet misses his way. When a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. Wealth brings many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friend. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who utters lies will not escape. Many seek the favor of a generous man, and everyone is afraid of a man who gives gifts. All a poor man's brothers hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, but does not have them. He who gets wisdom loves himself. He who keeps understanding will prosper. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who utters lies will perish. It is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, but less for a slave to rule over princes. Good sense makes a man slow to anger, and his glory to overlook an offense. A king's wrath is like a growling of a lion, but his favor is like dew upon the grass. A foolish son is ruin to his father, and a wife's quarreling is a continual dripping of rain. House and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Slothfulness casts into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger. He who seeks a commandment keeps his life. He who despises a word will die. He who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. Discipline your son while there is hope. Do not set your heart on his destruction. A man of great wrath will pay the penalty, for if you deliver him, you will only have to do it again. Listen to advice and accept instruction, that you may gain wisdom for the future. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will be established. What is desired in a man is loyalty, and a poor man is better than a liar. The fear of the Lord lends to life, and he who has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish, and will not even bring it back to his mouth. Strike a scoffer, and simple will learn prudence. Reprove a man of understanding, and he will gain knowledge. He who does violence to his father and chases away his mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. Cease, my son, to hear instruction, only to stray from the words of knowledge. A worthless witness mocks at justice, and the mouth of the wicked devours iniquity. Condemnation is ready for the for scoffers, and flogging for the backs of fools.
Thank you. Anything jump out?
It bothers me that this author thinks so little of the poor.
For example.
Well, his view of the poor is that they are poor of spirit as well as, well, I don't know what poor means here. Maybe you do, but I interpret it as poor of earthly possessions.
Right. Mostly.
But they also are in a poor community of people as far as interaction and stuff. There's a really fascinating article in the last Scientific American about the community of the slums of cities.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating article about how close the social safety net is in those communities.
Yep.
And I think, maybe I'm reading this wrong, but he's implying that the poor don't have that. That the poor are hated even by their fellow poor, which is, I don't think, true.
I don't know how to respond to that without knowing like which verses you're drawing on for that.
Well, it's wealth brings many friends, the poor are left friendless. I guess he's talking about the poor are ignored by the people of wealth. And then later on he says, if the poor are hated even by their kin, how much more are they shunned by their friends? When they call after them, they are not there. That's just not true.
Well, so we got a couple of different things going on. We have culture. There's some cultural differences between our world and their world. So
The poor are poor in any society.
right, but the modern and predominantly Western world has gone through great efforts to put the poor in particular places. We have built, especially on our economic principles, a system of keeping poor people in the same areas so that we don't have them in the other areas. Sometimes that's done intentionally, sometimes it's done unintentionally. So, for example, we get gentrification where people go, oh, here's this nice pretty house and it's super cheap. I can buy it and then I'll have an extra $50,000 to make it look nice. And if too many people do that in a poor neighborhood, all of a sudden the property taxes in the neighborhood go up on everybody, and the poor people who can't afford those taxes anymore have to move
So
out.
that's unintentional.
That would be, gentrification is often an unintentional way of forcing poor people. But it also has to do with, we've built a tax system that bases a person's property taxes on how their neighborhood and their community functions, which in some ways is an intentional effort to say, if you want to be part of a good community, you also have to be able to afford higher
So
taxes.
you're saying that 4,000 or 2,000 years ago, that there weren't places that the richer people lived? They didn't live on the hill overlooking the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, and that there were not places where the poor people lived?
The difference is that in the times in which this is written, the notion of a middle class almost doesn't exist at all.
So you have rich or poor.
So you pretty much have the rich and the
And
poor,
the poor don't live with the rich, I bet.
although here they're probably talking about the poorest of the poor, not just the not upper class. But also
So is that street people?
probably street people, or even people who can barely afford a home or can't afford a home. But
So homeless.
maybe. I want to be cautious about how I'm defining this. So the other side of it, though, is that in our Western world, wealth is a pretty large the wealthy is a pretty large portion of our society. We have a pretty high percentage of people who would fall into most categories of wealthy. Probably, depending on how you draw that line, somewhere around the top 20-30% of our society. The number of people who were wealthy,
It's more than that.
in
but
the,
anyway.
well, it depends on where you draw the line, and what you're comparing it to. If you compare us to the rest of the world, then
It's 90%.
99% of Americans are wealthy compared to the world. But within our own culture, 20-30% roughly, somewhere around there, are wealthy. Where in this culture, it was probably more like 2%. It's a big difference. So the people who were capable through their wealth of isolating themselves were literal kings, maybe the generals or the top officials of military positions, the maybe one or two or a small handful of religious officials, depending on the culture or the community. So the wealthy are a fairly small group in most of the areas of the world that this is written in.
I would say the author of this chapter, at least, is one of those 5% or whatever.
Maybe. But that does bring up an interesting question. So one of the challenges we have with reading wisdom literature is we just call it wisdom literature. And we could make an argument that, so first off, the authors of these are not writing wisdom literature from their perspective. We've given it that title later. What we have is a collection of sayings, and we don't know what the exact intents were of the author in collecting these sayings. It may have been just a preservation of culture, right? We've talked about that earlier. Like, we're not really sure what the motivations were. We might do better at instead of calling these all wisdom literature and just leaving it at that, we might lump these into different categories. I wrote down a couple as I was listening to this, because this chapter has a lot of different ones. So verse 4, like you said, wealth brings many friends, but the poor are left friendless, right? So this is what we might call a truism. Like, if you look out at the world, you see that people who have wealth and celebrity tend to have a lot of people flock around them. People who
Doesn't mean they're friends.
right. And I don't think the author is. I don't think this is
Or at
meant.
least my interpretation
Right,
of
right.
a friend.
I don't think the author here is saying that you're going to have a lot of good, close personal friends if you're wealthy. I think he's saying lots of people will flock to you if you're wealthy. And I don't think he's actually saying that if you're poor, you're going to have no friends at all. I think this is a comparison, right? The author's putting these two side by side. The wealthy have lots of people who flock to them, the poor do not. That doesn't mean they're actually friendless, that's hyperbole. And the wealthy don't actually have friends. They just have a lot of people who flock to them, right? So it's a truism in the sense that this is what we see in the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that's wisdom or advice. If we go to verse 9, so here we have a false witness will not go unpunished, and the liar will perish, right? So is that true? Does every single false witness get caught and get punished? No. It's an ideal. So we might call verses like this ideals. We would hope this would be true of society. In a truly just and perfect society, it would be true. So this is an ideal. We might teach our kids ideals, even though we know they're not true in the world. I mean, we teach our kids things like you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? Which is basically be nice to people. Life will go better for you if you are. But there are a lot of people who got very wealthy or got very near the top by screaming at people all day long. So clearly it's not absolutely true. But it's an ideal, and it's one we teach our kids as wisdom. Then we get probably a close similarity would be something like advice. So like verse 20, listen to advice and accept instruction. So this is, very directed at, here's something that you should do, right? That you may gain wisdom for the future. That, there's no ambiguity in it. It's pretty clear that should work out. It's good advice. That's wisdom in the sense of giving advice. And then we get the theological passages, which, are kind of complicated in that we take them to be true, but they aren't necessarily literally true, but they hold a certain kind of truth. So take 23, for example. The fear of the Lord is life indeed. Filled with it, one rests secure and suffers no harm. Well, I don't care how devout you are, you probably come to some harm in your life, either just aging or accidents or whatever, right? So it's not a literal truth, but there is a truth in that having faith in something outside of ourselves tends to give us a lot of comfort and help us get through difficulties and injury and harm. It allows us to feel more safe and secure even when things are not so safe and secure, right? Because if everything is dependent upon yourself, then whatever is going on right now, you have to fix it, right? So, but if we put our faith in other people or in our government or in the divine or whatever, there's a component of comfort that comes with that it doesn't all rest on us ourselves. So there's a theological truth that that frequently comes up in wisdom literature. I think it's helpful when we read these to remember that there's different kinds of wisdom being shared. And as we've talked about, there is, especially around the topic of wealth, there's often a bit of sarcasm.
Is what?
A bit of sarcasm.
Oh, yeah.
So remember verse 11 from the last
Yeah.
chapter. They imagine that their wealth produces a high wall. That's a pretty biting, sarcastic comment. Here, I think verse 4 should be interpreted as a bit of sarcasm, right? Wealth brings many friends. I think the author is assuming that people are going to understand what that means, that they're not actually friends. I'm gonna 7 though is interesting. That's the other one you brought up about wealth.
What one?
Verse 7, because that one's not sarcastic. That one's the one that's very negative about the poor.
Yeah, that's the one that really hit me. Yeah, I didn't agree with that.
So here's the Greek reads, "Everyone who hates a poor brother will also be far from friendship. Good understanding will come to those who know it, and a sensible man will find it. He who does much evil fully accomplishes evil, and he who provokes by words will not be saved." I think that's 7, 8, and 9 together. So when this G is Greek, right? I think. Let me double check that I'm saying the right thing here because there's special notations. So there's a number of different Greek translations. So the Fox notes in here that when this gets translated into Greek, it converts the first couplet, the one that we were talking about the poor being hated even by their kin, from a cynical assertion to a moral lesson. Let me look at it. Wow. So this is a fairly long verse, both in Greek and Hebrew and English, but the Syriac just says, He who is malicious in his words is not strong. So yeah, I think we have a couple things going on. I think there's some cultural in regard to how the poor are perceived here. We have some cultural nuances that we might not fully grasp the differences. There's also that the poor who are being spoken of here are probably also a similar small portion of the culture rather than entire communities. And the poor within each community are not representative of the whole community, the way most of that largely happens in our world today. Like we have whole expressions around this idea of where the poor people live, south of the tracks, right? Or down by the bridge. Or, there's all kinds of expressions in our culture about where poor people live that is indicative of a culture that has intentionally and unintentionally created spaces to section off the poor apart from society and culture, or the other parts of society and culture. And that wasn't the case here. So what your Scientific American article describes is absolutely true. There's a whole lot of studies for a long time that have supported this idea that within poverty-stricken communities, both the communal elements and even gang elements, because we tend to see gangs develop in poverty-stricken areas, are often rooted in issues of community and mutual support. There's a lot of kids who end up in gangs do so because they get a great deal of support within that gang that they don't see the rest of the world providing. Because we've created that. We see the same thing happening in prison cultures. When we segregate criminals into communities, there tend to be cultures that form around that idea, around those aspects. Whereas where we have prisons that integrate criminals into the culture around them, into the society around them as they're serving their time, there tends to be a lot less culture of prison.
Where are there prisons like that?
There are a number of mostly Catholic organizations. The one that always the key reference is Humaita. Humaita is a Catholic prison in Brazil. They don't accept violent criminals, so there's no murderers or rapists there. But just about any other kind of criminal can go there. And I don't know exactly how it's run today, but the last time I read about it, at any given time they had 2 paid staff running the whole prison, because the prisoners actually carried the keys to the prison and were involved in the operation of the prison, and most of them could leave the grounds, work a job, and come back as long as they remained responsible.
So they were petty thieves and drug users and
to my understanding, it's any kind of crime that wasn't a violent crime, like murder or a rape. But I don't know elaborate details. Humaita is often given as the prime example because we have a very predominantly punitive system in the United States, where we put people in jail or in prison for a lot of different reasons, more than any other country in the world. And we put them in there to be punished, and we often create a prison culture by doing so. And the result is that in the United States, the recidivism rate is about 70%. So 7 out of every 10 people who go to prison will end up back in prison in their lifetime. Which, when you also take into account that anybody over the age 55 actually, the recidivism drops to something like 5%. So at a certain age, people just age out of going back to prison. They get too old to keep committing crimes, essentially. And there are some people who get out of prison and will go commit crimes and not get caught. That means the actual number of people who are committing crimes after being in prison is a lot higher than 70%. Humaita, on the other hand, has a recidivism rate of 13%.
What country?
It's in Brazil. Humaita is the Catholic prison
Oh, okay.
where the prisoners run the prison. Because they're treated in a humane way, and the focus of Humaita is not on punishing the prisoners, but on helping them figure out how they will be restored to society, how they'll get back to being normal, functional part of people engaged in their community. We do almost none of that in the United States.
What was the penal system like at Christ's time? If you committed a violent crime, you were eliminated, right?
Oh yeah, I mean,
so the recidivism then was 0.
well, not 0, but yeah, most crimes were punishable by death up until, boy, I'm not even sure at what point the death penalty becomes less common. I mean, that certainly is one way to deal with it, but then we have the issue of how sure can you be about serving justice when you kill people? So.
Jesus certainly speaks to that.
Yep. So, we're just over time. Any other thoughts, comments, concerns? We tackled a lot today.
Well, I don't know about the other three, but I enjoy getting off on tangents. I mean, you get into society and you get into history.
I agree. It's the Bible. If we only take the Bible as a collection of words and not have any application or consideration, what are we doing with it? I mean, you might as well go read Wheel of Time. I just mentioned that because they're coming out with the show, and I keep thinking I gotta go back and read that again before the show and the movie come out. So, all right. Other thoughts? We'll close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for watching us online, and we should see you next week.